What if I told you that one of Hollywood's biggest stars tried to expose something dark and almost lost everything because of it? Not just his career, not just his reputation, but his entire place in the industry. For over 30 years, Mel Gibson has stood at the edge of Hollywood, sometimes praised as a genius, sometimes branded insane. But here's the question nobody wants to answer. Was he self-destructing? Or was he saying something that powerful people didn't want said? Because long before Hollywood's biggest scandals became public, Mel Gibson was already warning us, and almost no one listened. Mel Gibson has tried to warn people about what he believes are the hidden evils of the world for decades. For more than 30 years, he's repeatedly stepped into controversies that most celebrities avoid, sometimes accusing Hollywood power players of predatory behavior, other times taking verbal shots at political leaders, and often refusing to soften his stance when the backlash arrived. That refusal to self-censor made him enemies in places where enemies can be costly. Over time, his public image hardened into a list of labels that followed him everywhere: bigoted, unstable, abusive, dangerous, washed up, or simply crazy. In an industry where perception is currency, that reputation cost him major roles, severed relationships, and pushed him to the edge of professional exile. Most people fear public humiliation more than almost anything. Gibson, at least outwardly, has acted like humiliation is a familiar room he's already lived in. He has implied that after being dragged through enough scandals, he no longer fears the judgment itself. And yet, something shifted after his recent appearance on a major podcast platform. The conversation around him didn't just reopen, it noticeably tilted. Suddenly, you saw comments describing him as a rare kind of Hollywood figure: brilliant but volatile, gifted but haunted, a man who seems to stand at the crossroads between genius and self-destruction. The same person many had dismissed was being reframed as someone who might have been saying uncomfortable things before the culture was ready to hear them. In the years since the late 1990s, Hollywood's private ugliness has been exposed in waves. Stories once dismissed as impossible now sit in the center of mainstream discussion. Allegations of exploitation, coercion, and intimidation have become part of the public record in ways that would have sounded unbelievable not long ago. Against that backdrop, Gibson's old controversies look different to some people, not because his actions become harmless, but because the wider environment has changed. That is the tension at the heart of his story. A man who often spoke as if he were describing a rotten system, while also damaging himself with words and behavior that made him an easy target. To understand how his name became so radioactive inside Hollywood, you have to trace the turning points that reshaped his reputation. One early flashpoint came from a late 1990s interview in which he repeated a cruel, cynical idea he attributed to a successful producer: that women in movies are most valued when they are either nude or dead, and that both is better. Whether he intended it as an exposé, a dark joke, or a careless retelling, the line landed like a stain, because it echoed a reality many actresses have described for years: pressure, objectification, and a power structure that rewards compliance and punishes resistance. Around the same era, the industry became infamous for a whisper that eventually hardened into a running joke: get naked, get nominated. Even if awards voters aren't literally handing trophies to nudity, the pattern has fed a long-standing argument that women are more often pushed toward exposure, humiliation, or sexualized vulnerability as part of serious roles. That creates a darker question beneath the joke. In a system run by gatekeepers, how much of a performer's success is talent, and how much is the price of admission demanded behind closed doors? Gibson's relationship with Hollywood has always been complicated by the fact that he never grew up inside its social gravity. He wasn't raised as a polished industry insider who learned the rules before he learned the craft. He was born into a large family in the Hudson Valley region of New York, one of 11 siblings, and later moved with his family to Australia. There, away from Los Angeles mythology, he studied theater and performance while taking small roles and building a career from the ground up. His breakthrough came with Mad Max, a low-budget Australian production that exploded into global success and became a cultural landmark. That early victory wasn't just a career step. It created a myth: Gibson as the outsider who could smash through the system without needing permission. Sequels followed, and by the mid-1980s he had built enough momentum to command serious money and worldwide attention. He wasn't Juice. Another actor. He was a bankable face, a rising force. When he finally moved to Los Angeles, he has described feeling unsettled almost immediately. He talked about arriving with a sense that something was off, like he had wandered into a strange town where everyone stops talking when the newcomer walks into the room. At first, he questioned his own perception, telling himself he was being paranoid or misreading social cues. But he also claimed that over time, some of his worst suspicions felt confirmed. The ambiguity matters. Maybe he was reacting to the cold, performative culture of elite circles. Or maybe he believed he glimpsed something darker, hidden networks, private rituals of power, or a moral rot that stayed politely out of sight until you got too close. Despite the discomfort, he stayed. And in the late 1980s, Hollywood rewarded him with a massive leap in status. Lethal Weapon turned him into a top-tier star and launched a franchise that defined an era. His run through the 1980s and 1990s wasn't just successful, it was dominant. He stacked major hits, built global recognition, and became one of the highest-earning actors of his time. He voiced a Disney leading man. He starred in big thrillers. And then he directed and starred in Braveheart, a film that didn't merely perform well. It became part of pop culture memory, praised for its scale, its emotion, and the raw, defiant myth it built around freedom and sacrifice. At the height of that success, most celebrities protect the brand at all costs. Gibson did the opposite. He spoke publicly in ways that sounded reckless, sometimes framing his views as if he were pulling at a curtain that powerful people preferred to keep closed. In interviews, he suggested that world leaders may not truly be the ones making decisions, hinting at the existence of a deeper structure, unseen influence, entrenched power, and carefully chosen frontmen who absorb blame while real control stays hidden. These claims, framed in conspiratorial language, fascinated some audiences and alarmed others, especially as political polarization intensified over the following decades. But the problem with walking the line between critique and conspiracy is that the line is thin. Gibson's stories sometimes wandered into territory that sounded surreal, even to sympathetic listeners. He once described an encounter with Christopher Walken in a way that made the moment feel supernatural, as if Walken moved through the world with an eerie, theatrical grace that unsettled him. He described an ominous conversation, an atmosphere that felt cold, and an association his mind made in the moment that later sounded extreme. Whether the story was exaggerated, symbolic, or simply an odd memory told with too much flair, it fed a larger pattern. Gibson, as a man whose sense of unseen forces sometimes overtook his credibility. In that same spirit, he has used vivid imagery to describe Hollywood as a place that can humiliate you, break you down, and chip away at your life if you let it. In one metaphor, he painted the pressure like relentless, soulless forces pounding at the walls of your home, trying to break in. Taken literally, it sounds absurd. Taken emotionally, it sounds like a man describing temptation, corruption, and psychological warfare in the language of a nightmare. This kind of language has always collided with a long cultural fear, that Hollywood is not merely immoral, but spiritually contaminated. For generations, moral panics have flared around entertainment, accusing films and music of glamorizing darkness and shaping impressionable minds. In the 1980s, that fear surged into a national frenzy in parts of America, fueled by sensational claims and a media environment that loved panic as much as it loved profit. Much of it was overreaction, and much of it collapsed under scrutiny, but the emotional residue never fully vanished. For someone like Gibson, religious, combative, and suspicious, Hollywood's reputation as a moral battleground wasn't just a headline. It was a worldview. As he entered the early 2000s, his career looked unstoppable. He stacked box office wins and seemed positioned to remain an elite star for another decade. Then came the moment that defined both his peak and his downfall. He wrote and directed The Passion of the Christ, a film depicting the final hours of Jesus of Nazareth leading to the crucifixion. The movie drew intense reactions for its brutality and its devotional focus. Some saw it as an unflinching portrayal meant to confront viewers with suffering and sacrifice. Others felt it crossed into excess, leaning so hard into violence that it became disturbing rather than enlightening. The controversy grew deeper when major Jewish organizations argued that the film reinforced an old and dangerous narrative, that Jewish authorities and Jewish crowds were uniquely responsible for Jesus' death. Critics warned that such portrayals echo historical accusations that fueled persecution for centuries. The dispute was not merely about cinema. It was about how stories shape collective memory, how religious imagery can become political weaponry, and how a film can unintentionally or intentionally revive prejudices that societies have struggled to bury. And yet, financially, the film was a phenomenon. Made on a relatively modest budget, it generated hundreds of millions worldwide and became one of the most commercially successful R-rated films for years. Many Christian audiences credited it with inspiring renewed devotion and increased interest in faith. In other words, it achieved exactly what its supporters believed it was meant to achieve. But success did not protect Gibson from what came next. In fact, it may have amplified the explosion. In 2006, a late-night arrest in Malibu detonated his reputation in a way no movie controversy ever could. Gibson was stopped for speeding, and an open container was reportedly visible in the vehicle. His blood alcohol level was said to be well above the legal limit. What turned the incident into a career-threatening scandal was not merely the DUI, but the hateful remarks he allegedly made during the encounter, including anti-Semitic statements and aggressive comments toward the officer. Those reported words spread instantly and violently across the media landscape, locking a new narrative onto his name. Not just controversial, but openly hateful. He issued a public apology, including an apology directed to the Jewish community and an expressed desire to meet with Jewish leaders privately to seek understanding and a path toward repair. He also spoke more openly about alcoholism, describing it not as a bad habit, but as a relentless force that can override logic, love, career, and family. He framed relapse as a kind of personal disaster that becomes harder to recover from each time, a cycle that humiliates you, strips you, and leaves you exposed. For many people, the apology did not erase the damage. Some heard it as incomplete. Some saw it as strategic, issued under pressure rather than born from true remorse. And Hollywood, which can be forgiving when forgiveness is profitable, still has limits, especially when the public cost is too high. After that, Gibson largely vanished from major studio visibility for years. His absence fueled competing stories. Some believed he was simply paying the consequences of his own behavior. Others argued he was silenced, punished not only for a drunken rant, but for being too willing to criticize powerful groups. In the vacuum, myth grew. While Gibson was in exile, conspiracy culture didn't fade. It expanded. The internet turned old fears into viral ecosystems, and Hollywood became a permanent stage for symbolic suspicion. Pop stars and rappers were accused of belonging to secret societies based on hand signs, imagery, lyrics, and the endless human desire to explain fame as something more sinister than talent plus marketing. Artists sometimes leaned into it for attention, knowing outrage travels faster than nuance. Controversial visuals and shocking statements became fuel for algorithmic fire. Over time, those conspiracies grew darker and more political. Some narratives shifted from vague symbolism to explicit accusations of global elites committing horrific crimes. One of the most extreme claims involved the idea that powerful people harm children to harvest a substance for youth and vitality. That story has no credible scientific foundation, and it echoes older hateful myths that historically accused minority groups of ritualistic violence. Even when claims are presented as just questions, the structure of the narrative can revive ancient prejudices in modern packaging. The political side of these conspiracies surged during the rise of viral movements that presented themselves as coded truth campaigns. Believers argued that they were decoding hidden messages and exposing a secret war between good and evil. Critics argued it was a corrosive form of propaganda that turns ambiguity into certainty and speculation into conviction. It created a new cultural split, not just left versus right, but reality versus interpretation, evidence versus narrative. Then something happened that gave conspiracy thinkers a kind of grim validation, not for their wildest claims, but for the broader idea that powerful networks can hide terrible abuses. The arrest and death of Jeffrey Epstein became a turning point in public imagination. Epstein was a wealthy financier accused of trafficking and exploiting underage girls, with connections to influential figures. His case proved one thing beyond debate. Certain forms of elite access can coexist with monstrous behavior for a long time before accountability arrives. But because Epstein died before trial, many questions remained unresolved in the public mind. People demanded full transparency, names, records, and consequences. Instead, they received fragments, disputes, sealed documents, and years of argument over what was known, what was hidden, and who was protected. In that uncertainty, conspiracies didn't die, they multiplied. It was in this climate that Gibson re-emerged in a new way. He attached himself to a film that aimed to spotlight child trafficking and generate public awareness about exploitation. The movie became a box office success, and it sparked fierce debate. Supporters argued that even an imperfect portrayal can shine a light on a real global problem. Critics argued that the film and its surrounding commentary risked blurring reality with sensational narratives, especially when some of the people involved had publicly flirted with extreme conspiracy claims. The conflict wasn't just about filmmaking. It was about trust, credibility, and whether a serious issue was being framed responsibly or used as a political weapon. When Gibson later spoke on a major podcast, he did not focus solely on Hollywood. He leaned into a broader spiritual framework, describing the world as a battlefield between good and evil forces fighting over human souls. He asked why humanity would matter in such a cosmic struggle, as if even our flaws make us valuable to forces larger than we understand. For listeners who already see the world through that lens, it sounded like truth spoken plainly. For skeptics, it sounded like the same old pattern: intensity without proof, conviction without grounding. At the same time, Hollywood itself has changed. The industry is more openly political, and public pressure pushes entertainers to take positions or be condemned for silence. Many viewers feel modern storytelling is being bent to fit ideology. Add in the endless rumor cycles, the moral scandals, and the growing distrust of institutions, and it's not surprising that some audiences now look at Hollywood with fatigue, suspicion, or outright disgust. There's also been a cultural shift in how people respond to celebrities who talk about trauma or exploitation. In the past, some were mocked, dismissed, or treated as unstable. More recently, audiences have been willing to reconsider old narratives, especially around former child stars and systemic abuse in entertainment spaces. What was once brushed off as crazy is now sometimes re-examined as a possible sign of harm, manipulation, or survival. In the middle of all this, Gibson has been pulled back into public relevance in ways that would have seemed impossible during his lowest years. Political figures have even publicly referenced him in symbolic roles tied to fixing or reforming Hollywood. Whether those announcements are serious policy or theater, they reinforce one reality: Gibson is no longer just a disgraced actor. He is a cultural symbol, used by different groups to represent different arguments. So what is the most honest way to read his story? He recognized something unsettling about Hollywood early on, even if he struggled to articulate it cleanly and sometimes expressed it in ways that damaged his credibility. He may have been right that the industry can be predatory, narcissistic, and morally hollow in places, but he also committed actions and spoke words that many people find indefensible. He wasn't a perfect messenger. In fact, at times he was his own worst enemy, an unstable vehicle for ideas that might have landed differently coming from someone with restraint. And yet one thing about him has remained consistent. He has rarely pretended to be neutral. He has rarely softened his worldview to keep his career safe. He has chosen, again and again, to be the kind of man who says what he believes, even when it costs him everything. Whether that makes him courageous, reckless, or both is the question audiences keep returning to. Because in the end, Mel Gibson's story isn't only about Hollywood. It's about power, punishment, belief, and the uncomfortable truth that a person can be both perceptive and deeply flawed at the same time. Now I want your honest opinion. Was Mel Gibson unfairly silenced for speaking out? Or did he destroy his own legacy? There's no middle ground here, and I want to see where you stand. Comment your perspective below. I'm going to be reading the top responses. If you want more deep breakdowns on Hollywood, power, and the stories behind the headlines, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next episode dives into something even more controversial. And trust me, you'll want to see that one from the beginning.